All right, thank you everybody for joining the LIHWAP annual report training. As I mentioned, my name is Rachel Hammond. I'm a program specialist on the LIHWAP team serving regions 8 and 9. We have a lot of folks from our team here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and I will go ahead and dive right in. First, housekeeping, we are recording this so that we can post it on our website for everybody's reference afterwards. If you have questions that come up throughout the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat or write it down for yourself to ask at the end. We will have at least 30 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. The LIHWAP annual report is due on January 31st of 2023, so almost exactly 2 months from now. This is the same day that your quarterly report for fiscal year 2023 quarter 1 is due. The annual report will cover whenever you started your LIHWAP implementation through September 30th of 2022. If someone on our team wouldn't mind dropping the link to it in the chat, it is an Excel file just like the quarterly report. We also have instructions in a PDF that you can reference while you're filling it out. Similarly to the quarterly report, we ask that you email it to both your program specialist and LIHWAP reports at acf.hhs.gov to submit your report. You don't need to upload it anywhere else, just an email will do. You're also more than welcome to submit it early. Since it covers the period ending September 30th, 2022, you might already have all the data you need. And since you are attending the webinar today, you will hopefully have all the tools that you need to fill it out. Maybe ahead of time if that works for your schedule. So anytime before or on January 31st, 2023 is when it is due. So for the rest of the presentation, we're just going to walk through each section and go over how it should be filled out. I'm joined by my colleague, Mary Watts, who is our policy branch chief, and we will be tag teaming this presentation. So the first tab of the report just asks for information about who is filling it out. So you should put your name, your phone number, your email, and then similarly to the quarterly report, we ask that you write your name, sign it, and put the date. It does not have to be your designated official who is the authorizing official for the report. It can be the program manager that's filling it out, though it can of course be your designated official if your internal policies dictate that it should be that person. Similarly to the quarterly reports, if your signature feature in Excel is not working, you can just type your name into the box where it asks for a signature. We don't want that to prevent you from submitting your report on time. So again, type your name in there if you cannot get the signature feature to work. And now I will pass it over to Mary, who will go through the second tab of the report, Module 1, Use of Funds.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. So this is the first section of the report that is going to actually be the first time you're probably providing us with any financial information. So we're going to go over this section and kind of also then at the end do some key takeaways for the entire section just to keep in mind as you're filling it out. So first, just to start, just want to make sure that everyone remembers that both the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the American Rescue Act need to be tracked separately. So you'll see A and B throughout this entire financial reporting section, and that's where you'll report those funds separately. Section C is reserved for possible future funding if LIHWAP were to receive any funding outside of the Consolidated Appropriations Act and American Rescue Act. So for now, those should be left completely blank throughout the entire financial reporting section, similar to how you probably have seen on the quarter 3 and quarter 4 obligation data. The section C reserved for possible future funding is left blank. So just reminding those, you don't need to fill any of that out. So this first section goes over your actual award amount in the first one. So that would be from both the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the American Rescue Act separately. And this is what you were awarded originally. For those tribes that received a supplemental additional funding, that was not awarded until October. So that was after this funding, after this reporting period. So this should be your original amount without that supplemental funding that was given in October. And then we go to the next few sections and we have the estimated numbers. So this is actually coming out of your implementation plan that was approved. This is kind of like your budget. What was the estimated household benefit in a number format, not in a percentage. The estimated amount you were spending on outreach and eligibility, estimated for administration funds as the recipient, and then the estimated administration funds for subrecipients if that is applicable. Again, those should be coming out of what your approved LIHWAP implementation plan was. And then it'll auto-calculate the admin cost cap. So you can see at the bottom, and that is just for internal purposes for us to kind of track and do some double checking. So it will auto-calculate. So you do not need to include any, you do not need to put in any numbers there. All right, next slide. All right, so now we're getting into reporting both the funds, the American Rescue Plan and the Consolidated Appropriations Act, as far as your service amounts. So you have the three different service types. So we have the restoration of services, prevention of disconnection of funds, and reduction of rates charged, meaning current bills. And again, you will see the reserve for possible future funding on each of those sections. So please leave those blank for each of those. So there's really only 6 figures that you will actually be filling out in this section. And it is in 2 different ways. We have actual funds obligated and actual funds expended. So the obligation amounts are funds you made a definite commitment to pay for goods and services in each of the categories through September 30th. So we know that some of you might have a different interpretation of obligation that might differ from state to state. So this definition might be very loose. So please refer to your own policies and procedures of what you define as obligation. And if you do not define obligation and you do not obligate funds, you can use the expended amount in that category as well. So just again, obligation, make sure it's following your own policies and procedures, and this definition is relatively loose. And then you have the actual funds expended. So that means funds that were distributed for benefits, spent for outreach, administration, and so forth. And in this category, it's just going to be for the benefits amount. So you have the 3 different areas. So you have restoration of service funds, prevention of disconnection of funds, and reductions of rates charged. Now, this might differ slightly from what you're reporting on your quarterly reports because those can be duplicated. For example, you might pay a benefit to a household for restoration of service because they were disconnected. So you pay their entire arrearage amount, and you also pay some funds for their current bill. However, in this category for the funds for the funding portion, you want to post that in the area that it is the priority point. So for example, if they were disconnected and you made a payment to restore their funds, even if it had some amount for a current bill, you're going to report that under the restoration of services. And same thing with the prevention of disconnection. So those 2 are your priority payments. It's really what was the intent of that funding. So if it does go over multiple categories, make sure you kind of go into it with the example of what was the purpose of that benefit amount. All right, next slide. So this is basically going to be the same funds that you reported in the previous category, but it's going to be reported in a different way. So this is going to reflect if it was a water or wastewater payment, multiple services payment, or other water services payment. So for example, again, this could be duplicative in your quarterly report service numbers, but for the funding purposes, you want it unduplicated and you want it to be for the priority payment. So for those that for the obligation and the expended amount. So we have the water and wastewater, which is generally mostly a very basic bill. It contained water and or wastewater or combined bill. The multiple services, which might include some other costs that are associated with the water funds. That might be small payments for stormwater or so forth. And then we also have the other water services that would reflect if you had something a little bit more specific you asked for in your implementation plan that might have been for an emergency bottled water program or something along those lines. So this is very replicative of what you have been reporting in your quarterly reports, but it is the funding portion and it is unduplicated. So one thing that I just want to reiterate is that we have that section here that says multiple services that includes water and other non-water services. So if you recall at the beginning of the program, we had this language in the quarterly and annual reports, and we did shift this language and released guidance on May 4th. And that was an information memorandum guidance with an FAQ that talked about that you cannot actually spend any service awards for anything other than water. So for example, trash. So if you did have payments that were made with trash, those payments would have had to have been done prior to that May 4th date when that official guidance was released. So it is okay so please do include those in this financial portion, but just remember that after May 4th, those were a non-allowable cost at that point. All right, next slide. Now we get into the other categories that are non-benefit amounts for you to report on. And again, we have the section C where you want to make sure you leave those blank. But you have the first section is the outreach and eligibility. And then there's 3 different things you want to report on. First is the estimated funding, and that is really reflective of your budget and what you submitted in your approved implementation plan. Then you have what was obligated in that category, as well as in what was expended. And again, you want to report those separately for the Consolidated Appropriations Act, as well as the American Rescue Act. And then we go into the other 2 categories, the administration for the recipient, and it is the same format again in the 3 different areas: estimated funding allocations, funding obligations, and funding expenditures. And then the last one is the administration for a subrecipient, if that is applicable for your program, with the 2 different funding sources, Consolidated Appropriations Act and the American Rescue Act, in the 3 different formats. The estimated funding, which again is from the implementation plan, your budget, and then the obligation amounts and what was actually expended. And I think that concludes most of this section, but next slide. And then in this section, and I think throughout most of the sections in the report, we do have a place for remarks. And this is if there is something that provides further explanation or a clarification on the data. You can add any comments into this section. So that would flag for your program specialist to review a particular part, which might need more explanation. All right, next slide. So just a quick overview of everything that we went through. I know that was probably quick, so this slide will hopefully refer back to some of the major areas to think about. So one is that the 2 funds need to be reported separately, the CAA and the American Rescue Plan. And then for anything that is the estimated amounts, please refer to your implementation plan for the percentages of your award in each category. For example, if you had 75% of household benefits, you might have had the 10% for outreach eligibility, 5% for admin recipient, and then 10% for the subrecipient. And remember that administration costs could not exceed 15% of the total award, and we do have that check on the first section of this financial document. And then if you do need a copy of your implementation plan that was approved to make sure that you are filling out those estimated categories correctly, then you can email your program specialist and you can make sure you have the most updated one. The grant award amounts in section 1 should match the estimated funding allocations in section 3. So when you're going through that, make sure that they are matching. Unfortunately, because this is an Excel spreadsheet, there is not a way where it will kind of flag for you that it's off. Our program specialists, when they're reviewing the reports, will make sure to let you know if there's something that doesn't match. But this is one area that we want to make sure that you check that those 2 areas match. And then the amounts and totals entered in this section should never exceed your total award. Again, this should not include your supplemental for tribes that was in October of this year, but everything needs to be less than your total award or your total award. And then another kind of thing is that if there's any cell that is shaded in gray, that is referring to the fact that it should be left blank and you should not add any sort of numbers or percentages into that area. All right, well, that is the complete financial section. I will pass it back over to Rachel to go over the household report.
Thanks, Mary. So yes, the next section, tab 3, is called Module 2, and it is the household report. So the previous section was asking more about dollar amounts. This one is all about the households that you have served during fiscal year 2022. Section 1 on this tab asks about the number of households that either applied or were assisted through LIHWAP. So first, you'll be asked to report on the total unduplicated number of households that applied for LIHWAP. This includes those who were ultimately approved to receive benefits and those who were not approved. Number 2 asks for the number of households that were actually assisted. So these are people who applied and received assistance during fiscal year 2022. Finally, number 3 asks for the number of waitlisted households that you have. So this would be households who applied but were unable to be assisted because there was lack of funding. So many of you still have funding and this section will not be applicable to you, but if you ran out of funds in fiscal year 2022 and have waitlisted households, you would report them here. You do not need to have processed their application to include them in this count, so you don't need to know if they would have ultimately been approved or not. And for this section and for pretty much all of Module 2, we are asking for unduplicated counts. That means that if a household applied and received assistance more than once, they should still only be counted one time when reporting in this section. Next part is the number of assisted households by assistance type. This should look familiar to what you've been reporting on the quarterly reports. It asks about the 3 priority groups for LIHWAP. First, households who received restoration of services benefits. This is if they have been cut off or disconnected from water or wastewater, and the LIHWAP benefit allows them to be reconnected and have their services restored. Second section is prevention of disconnection of services. So these are instances where a household received a disconnect notice due to lack of payment or late payment on their bills, and the LIHWAP benefit prevented their services from being disconnected. Final category is reduction of rates charged. These are households who are current on their bills but still requested and received assistance to help ensure that their water and wastewater bills were affordable. Again, we're asking that you report unduplicated numbers. So say somebody, applied and received assistance twice for reduction of rates charged, you would still only report them once. And we have an example of a couple scenarios on this next slide. So I'm going to walk through these 5 households. Household A received restoration of services and reduction of rates charged benefits. So they would be reported once in this first row, restoration of services, and once in the third row, reduction of current rates charged. Household B received a prevention of disconnection benefit, so they would be counted once in the second row. Household C applied for restoration of services benefit, but they did not receive it because they were not eligible for LIHWAP. In this case, they would not be counted in this section because they did not receive a benefit. Household D received prevention of disconnection and reduction of rates charged benefits. So they will be reported once in row 2 for prevention of disconnection of services and once in row 3, reduction of current rates charged. Finally, household E received reduction of rates charged benefits twice, once in November and once in February. They received these benefits twice, but it was the same type of benefit, so they should only be counted once in row 3, reduction of current rates charged. I see that some folks have been putting their hands up. We will answer all questions at the end, but please feel free to put them in the chat in real time or just hold on to them and we will be sure to get back to you at the end. So part 3 of module 2 asks for the number of assisted households by the poverty interval that they fall under. So similar to the previous section, we're asking by the type of LIHWAP assistance they received. We're just asking that you further break it out by where in the federal poverty guidelines they fall. And even if you were collecting, determining eligibility based on state median income, we still ask that you report using the federal poverty guidelines. Since you will have their income, you can still report this easily. If you need information on on what the federal poverty guidelines were for fiscal year 2022, please reach out to us and we can provide you with that information. You should also be sure to still report on households that were determined eligible for LIHWAP through categorical eligibility in this section. You can still use the income level that they were used to determine eligibility for whatever program they received categorical eligibility through. So for example, if someone received LIHEAP and you have their income level and household members from their LIHEAP application, you would use that information for the LIHWAP reporting. Finally, I'll note that income and household size can change over the course of a year. So if someone applied for LIHWAP twice, you should just use the reported income and household numbers from the first time they applied. You do not need to account for the change in household status over the course of the year. The next section 4 asks for you to report on the number of assisted households by vulnerable population. So here we're asking for any household that you assisted that had members who are in one of the following 3 target groups. 1, someone who is elderly, or OCS's definition, which is 60 years or older. Anybody who is disabled, or anybody who is a young child, which is 5 years old or younger. If you have a different definition for what is elderly or what is a young child, we ask that you please report using OCS's definition. So say that you define elderly as 55 or older, we ask that you limit it to just 60 years or older for the purposes of the annual report. Next, I'm going to go walk through a definition of kind of how this would play out in practice. Again, through 2 examples of households. So household A received restoration of services benefits. They have 4 members, Al, who is 36, Kathy, who is 29, Tom, who is 67, and Fran, who is 72 and disabled. So since they received restoration of services, they will be reported once in the restoration of services row and once in the any type of LIHWAP assistance row. They have 2 people who are elderly, so we'll report them once in the elderly column. So here, they also have someone who is disabled, that's Fran, so we report them in the disabled column here. Additionally, we will include their number in column D for having any member who's part of a vulnerable population. You will also include them in the bottom row, any type of LIHWAP assistance in the same columns. Again, because they have an elderly member, a disabled member, and then they fall under the any category. The second household I'll walk through an example with is household B. They received prevention of disconnection and reduction of rates charged benefits. They also have 4 members, Ellen, who is 2 and disabled, Brian, who is 4, Charlie, who's 27, and Sylvia, who is 27. Since they received 2 types of assistance, they will be reported in both of those rows, as well as the final row for any type of LIHWAP assistance. They have 2 young children, so they will be reported once in each row for that category. They also have a disabled member, Ellen, so they will be reported in that column as well. Finally, since they have they fall under the any member within a vulnerable population, they will be reported in the final column. I'm just going to take a pause for a sip of water because this is a lot. Now we'll move on to the next section. So section 5 asks for the assisted household applicants by race and ethnicity. So here we're talking about people who received LIHWAP assistance and solely the applicant for that household. And here we ask you to report on their ethnicity and race. Rows 4 and 9 will auto-calculate, and they should match the total number of unduplicated assisted households that you report in section 1 on this tab. Again, these numbers are unduplicated, meaning that if someone received assistance, say 2 times, they should still only be counted once in this total. Collecting race and ethnicity data was optional for fiscal year 22. So if you were not collecting this, we ask that you report all of those applicants under the unknown or not reported category. So again, please don't leave this blank, just put everybody under unknown or not reported. It is required that you collect this information for fiscal year 2023, so everyone should be collecting this information now. Next, we ask you to report on the number of assisted household applicants by gender. This is very similar to the previous section. We're again only asking about the applicant of assisted households. The total number will auto-calculate, and it should match the total unduplicated number of households assisted reported in section 1. Gender information was also optional for fiscal year 2022. So if you are not collecting this, please report all of those people in the unknown or not reported category. Please do not leave this section blank. The next part of module 2 asks about the housing type of assisted households. So whether somebody owns their home, rents their home, or some other category. We break out the renters into 2 categories. One, people who rent but have their utility billed separately, so they pay their own water bill, or someone who rents and has their water bill included in their rent. We also included this other category for people who may not fall into either of these, for any of these groups. For example, someone who lives in a mobile home, perhaps they own their home, but they park it on rented land. That might be a scenario where you report them in the other category. Again, this information was optional to collect in fiscal year 2022. So if you do not have this information for each assisted household, please include them in the unknown or not reported category. You should be collecting this data for fiscal year 2023, and we'll include it on next year's annual report. The next section is similar in that it asks about race, ethnicity, and gender, but this time it's asking for all household members and not just the applicant. Again, we have it will auto-calculate the total for each section. And again, this was optional for fiscal year 2022. If you are not collecting this information, please just enter the number of household members in the unknown or not reported categories. These numbers should be higher than your unduplicated number of households assisted, since each household has at least 1 member, and I'm assuming most households have more than 1 member in it. You should also be collecting this data for fiscal year 2023, so everyone should currently be collecting this data, but you do not have to report on it for fiscal year 2022. The final part of module 2 asks about the use of funds to non-public water systems for emergency home water service. So this section should be filled out by grant recipients who provide assistance with other water services, such as bottled water and septic tank pumping. If you do not provide other water services, you do not have to fill out this section. You can put zeros. This is for grant recipients who had it approved in their implementation plan to provide these other services. These numbers should again be unduplicated. The first row, private water delivery, that is where you would enter households who receive bottled water or other kind of water delivery. Private waste hauling is where you would report on septic tank pumping. And then we have an option for other types of services. For example, if you use LIHWAP funds to pay to have water cisterns filled for households. If you do report something in section 3, we ask that you specify what these services were in the response box below it. Finally, we again have a remarks section on this tab where you can enter any clarifications about the data that you included. For example, maybe you weren't initially collecting gender data for your household applicants, but started partway through the fiscal year. So you have that data for some people, but others are just reported in the not reported category. You could explain when you started collecting that data. And again, we just have some takeaways that I've repeated a lot throughout this section. It's good to refer back to when you are filling it out. If you didn't collect optional data, please don't leave that section blank. Just report everybody under the unknown or not reported category. When we're asking about the number of unduplicated households assisted by various metrics, all of those numbers should match. And then finally, in the section that asks about all household members, that does include the applicant. I'm going to pass it back to Mary, who will walk us through the final module, module 3.
Thank you. All right, so the final module is the performance data, and there are 3 main sections in it. So the first section is water burden targeting, and there are 3 separate things to report on. So just as a reminder, Water burden is the proportion of a total household income spent on drinking water and or wastewater utility bills during a specific time frame. So that is the definition in the instructions, and that's what we would like you to follow for water burden. So we have had a few questions already sent to us around water burden. So we're hoping to simplify it today. And if you need further questions specific to your program that we're not able to get to today, please join our office hours next week and or January in order to get some specific questions answered about your program. But I'm going to go through the 3 sections. So the first one is the average water benefit payment by service type. So service type is referring to the restoration of services. So if it was disconnected, prevention of disconnection, and reduction of rates charged for current bills. So you're going to divide the amount of dollars paid in household benefits by the number of households assisted, so that you just want to find the average for each of those sections. And then we have 2 other portions of this area. And the first one is pre-water burden average by service type. So the pre-water burden average is referring to what the water burden was before you assisted this household or customer. So for each assisted household, you want to divide their water and wastewater utility bills by their household income, and this will result in a percentage. So sections 2 and 3 for water burden, pre and post, should be percentage based. And then after calculating the average burden for each household, or after calculating the burden for each household, then you will take the average and you will give the average percentage in that area. Now, one thing that we've had questions about is the time frame for calculating this burden, because we did not require that you go back and get 12 months worth of data on their utility bills for water. So we want to ensure that you are using the same time frame for the utility bill amount and household income. So for example, if you have a monthly utility bill and annual income, you're going to divide that annual income by 12 before calculating the water burden. So if you are paying for a current bill, so you're only paying for that 1 month's worth, or you're paying for 2 months worth, you're going to divide their annual income by however many months it is that you're paying for that bill. Now, if you do not know the number of months covered by a water bill, and we know that this is going to probably be mostly an issue for restoration of services or prevention of disconnection, meaning that they have a lot of arrearages and it might just say past due balance and it doesn't actually go over a time frame, and you're not able to determine the amount of months that that bill is covered, we're asking you not to include it in the calculation. So you don't have to try to go back to the water service provider and determine how many months it's worth, or go back to the household. We're just asking you to include what you're able to for this pre-water burden calculation. All right, next slide. So for the post-water burden service type, we're asking for basically what is the water burden after you have assisted that household. So for each assisted household, subtract the LIHWAP benefit amount from the household's initial water or wastewater utility bill. Then you're going to divide that result from above by their household income, and that will be a percentage. And just like the pre-burden, you're going to, after calculating the burden for each household, then you will take the average. And again, we want to make sure that you're using that same time frame. And if you aren't able to do the time frame, then you would not be including it. And we do have on the annual report where it says the post burden, if applicable, for restoration of services and prevention of disconnection, because we know that a lot of you are just paying the entire bill and you would not know the post burden because you're not calculating what their costs might be moving forward on a monthly basis. So that might not be necessary to put a post-water burden in those categories at all. However, for current rates charged for current bills, you are required to use a benefit matrix, and part of the benefit matrix was to include water burden as part of the requirements for determining the benefit amounts. So you would report that post-water burden for the current rates charged section. All right. So we just wanted to give a little bit of an example So for the water burden target example, so household A has a gross annual income of $30,000. So they apply for rate reduction assistance, meaning their current bill. So the month they apply, their water bill was $250. So based off of your benefit matrix, let's say they receive a benefit award amount of $150 for LIHWAP. So you would determine their pre-water burden first. You would take that $30,000 of the total annual income. You would divide that by 12 to figure out what their monthly income is, and that would be $2,500. Then you would do the amount of their bill that they are asking you to cover. So that in this example was $250. Divide that by their monthly income to get that percentage of the pre-water burden. So that is the 10%. Then you're going to do the post-water burden for this customer. You would take their total bill, which was $250. You would subtract that with the amount that you paid. In this example is $150. And then they have $100 remaining balance. So then you would take that $100, divide that by the $2,500, which is their monthly income, to find out what their post-water burden average. And in this example, it's 4%. So those are the two different scenarios for the reduction of rate reduction assistance, meaning current rates. All right, next slide. Excuse me. All right, so then we have the next section, and it is very similar to what you've already been doing in your quarterly reports, but it is expanded through the entire year. And there are multiple sections for unduplicated and duplicated in each of the areas. So you're reporting for the service type versus the type of service. You're going to be reporting by the 3 priority groups, which is the restoration, prevention of disconnection, and reduction of current rates. And then you're going to be reporting that with the water or wastewater bills versus multiple services or other water services. So this is very similar to what you've already been doing in your quarterly reports, but there is a section for you reporting unduplicated count and duplicated count separately. So right now in the quarterly reports, you've been reporting this area in a duplicated format. So we're asking you to also just include the unduplicated count for this area. And that's really the only difference. It's just expanded for the entire service area up until September 30th. So that's really, I think, this entire section, and that goes over all of the performance measures. So just a couple of takeaways. One is the water burden should be reported as a percentage. So the entire area for water burden should be a different percentage for each of them in the average percentages. And then another takeaway is for the post-water burden average may not be necessary for restoration of services and prevention of disconnection. So we're not asking you to go back and try to determine what their ongoing cost is going to be for water for months ahead if you are not paying any sort of current bills. And in the report, you will see that section say if applicable. All right, I will pass it back to Rachel.
All right, so that wraps up our walkthrough of the annual report. I'm sure folks have questions they would like to ask. Before we jump in, I'm just going to give you a quick reminder that we will be holding 8 office hours for smaller groups. So registration for these office hours is capped at 14 grant recipients. I'm just going to ask someone from our team to put the link to sign up for those in the chat. We have 4 in December and 4 in January. Additionally, if you would like one-on-one assistance, please just email your program specialist and we'd be more than happy to meet with you and walk through any questions you have about the report. This webinar was recorded. We will be posting it on our webpage, as well as this actual presentation will be posted on our website. So if you would like to use these as resources when you're filling out the report, you will definitely be able to do that.